Okay, welcome everybody. Sorry about the lecture getting canceled last night. Like I said, I had a minor emergency here at the house I had to take care of, but everything's fine. It was just a time-sensitive issue that I had to deal with right at that moment. But anyway, what I was going to go over in that lecture and what I will create a video about right now is working with color negatives and color film in the 3F platform, then ultimately in Photoshop. So what I've done is I've created some 3F scans, a few different ones to show you a few different things, both negative and positive color 3F scans. And I'm going to show you how to bring those into the Flexcolor software and how to use some of the tools specific to color to do some basic image editing in the 3F platform so that you have less work to do once you get over to Photoshop. So let me go ahead and launch Flexcolor. We have it here, and it's going to come up just like this when you guys launch it. And if you remember from our previous lectures, the way we access our 3F scans is through this grid icon here. And when I hover over it, it says thumbnails window. When I click on that, it brings up this separate window, which shows me within the folder that I have selected, the 3F files that exist in there. So I have it under this folder, 3F scans, then new, which I have for you guys. But these are the negatives I'm going to be working with. You just need to remember where you put the 3F scans. I'm going to upload them onto Canvas, and so you just need to move them onto a folder on your desktop and then navigate to that folder and you'll see them here. So to start working on one of these images, you just double click on the thumbnail that you want to bring into the workspace. So I'll double click on this one, and it opens up the 3F scan. Now, you can see that its color is pretty off. It's really kind of cyan, it's low contrast, and we need to fix some of those things. So we need to go through basically the same process we've gone through to black and white, but we just have to start working for color now as well. So the first thing we have to look at are these three menus up at the top. So setup, frame, and mode. Now, I set these up accurately in the original 3F scan. So we have negative RGB standard. I could have selected a particular type of film, but this negative that I'm working on is pretty old. And even if I selected, say, Portrait 160 NC, it's possible that the image could have kind of faded or the backing could have changed color a little bit, and that wouldn't have got us very much closer anyway than just using the negative RGB standard. So I chose to do negative RGB standard. This is a medium format negative, so I shot this on a 645 camera, not a 4x5. So I selected 60 by 45 millimeter as my frame, because that's the 645 frame. And then mode right here is default to RGB, but we want to go ahead and select RGB 16-bit. That's going to give us the most color and the most image data to work with. So 16-bit is very, very important for both black and white and color. Always choose the 16-bit option, whether it's grayscale 16-bit or RGB 60-bit. Okay, once we have these things set up, then we can actually go in and start doing our image corrections. So we want to start with the histogram adjustment first. So I'm going to open that up, and we have our histogram here. And now notice I have my RGB overall histogram, which I can control exposure and contrast with. Then I have my breakouts for my different color channels, my red channel, my green channel, my blue channel. This is where I'm going to do the majority of my color editing work, is in these breakout channels down here. But before I can get going on that, I need to draw my marquee, because remember, when you draw your marquee, it samples everything that's inside of that marquee to build the histogram. Now, because I've selected the white border around the outside of the image, it's giving me this big white peak here, and that represents that white border, but that's not really part of the image. So I want to make sure I draw my marquee completely within the edges of the image, so it's only sampling the image data and not the white background. So that looks pretty good. And now you see I don't have that big white peak over here anymore. My histogram data actually starts in a bit. So first thing you want to do, bring your white point on the RGB histogram in to the start of the histogram, bring your black point in to the start of the histogram. And now you can sort of look at it and set a midpoint if you want. But before you do that, what I would do is make the same adjustment for each of your color channels. So I'm going to go to my red channel, bring my white point in to the very start of the red histogram, right about there, And it's gonna look a little crazy at first. But you'll see as we work through the other color channels, it'll balance itself out. So now I go to my green, bring the green point in, black point in on the bottom, and then same with my blue. It's about where it needs to be on the white point for the blue. So I'll just bring my black slider up on the blue. And now that's basically setting the white and black point for the various color channels. And now that looks better, but it still looks kind of yellow in, overall, maybe yellow and a little bit red. That's where we need to play with our neutral sliders here. So I think mainly the problem is yellow. So I'm gonna start bringing in a little bit more blue to try to fix that. So I'm just sliding my midpoint slider, my neutral slider down in the blues. And I'll start bringing out a little red as well, because red is somewhat problematic. And that's getting close-ish. Now, it's just a matter of kind of fine-tuning it to get where we want it to be. I think that's looking pretty close. And now we can go in and just do any sort of exposure adjustments that we want. If it needs to be darker, if it needs to be brighter. I think I kind of like this right about there. So that's where I kind of want to stop with the histogram tool. You could sit here and kind of fine tune it. Like maybe I put a little bit too much blue in the shadows or something. I want to kind of back that out, give it a little bit more warmth. You could play with that. But basically with the histogram tool, you want to get it overall in the right general area. And then once you're done with that, you can move on to your other tools. So we have a curve tool where we can break it out into our various color channels and start working with it like you would with a curve tool in Photoshop. So if we think it needs contrast, we could, make an S-curve basically where we bring the highlights up, the shadows down to add a little bit of contrast to it. I think that probably does help, but you don't want to do any real kind of major adjustments in this tool or really in the scanning software at all. If you want to really start altering the way things look, then that's going to be in the next step in Photoshop. What we want to do and what the goal is in the Flexcolor software is just to get it looking pretty much neutral. So no color casts, no real strong contrast, no real strong negative contrast. So we don't want it to be really, really flat. We don't want it to be really, really contrasty. We just want to retain all the information and get the color in generally the right place. And then we can move on into Photoshop and start really fine tuning it. So like, for example, I know that this water is rendering a little bit more green than it was when I was there. It was really turquoisey, but the sky looks about right. And if I start trying to boost the color in this water, I might start affecting the sky. So I know that in Photoshop, I can deal with this water area with like a hue saturation tool or a mask and get it looking right. But we don't have a lot of really fine tuning control in Flexcolor. So we just want to get it generally right in Flexcolor and then go from there in Photoshop. So I'm not going to do too much in my curves tool, but you can do some things if you want. A lot of the times what you have is like cast issues, but only in the highlights or only in the shadows. So sometimes you might notice a lot of green in the shadows, but not in the highlights, right? So that's where the curves tool comes in really handy. You can come into the magenta or the green tool and you can pull green out of the shadows, but bring it back into the highlights. You can't do that in the histogram tool. That's where the curves tool is really helpful because you can deal with the color in relationship to the density of the area. But again, I don't need to do that in this image. Everything looks pretty much good. So I'm gonna just go ahead and go out of the curves tool. And then the other tools we have here are the color correction tool, which you can play a little bit with saturation and then break out basically the tonalities. So if I say, well, that red in the sand doesn't look quite right, and I want that to be a little bit more red, but I don't want to add red like in the salt down here at the bottom because that looks right. You would come into the color correction tool and select the reds channel and just add in red basically, and it would bring red up in the areas where the reds exist, but it wouldn't add it to like the blues and the greens and the neutrals. I don't need that in this image, so I'm just gonna go ahead and reset that back to 0. And like I said, I don't really think I need to do much with this in this particular image. Some images you might, some images you probably don't, but I think overall this is looking pretty much Right, so I don't need to mess with this too much, but you could if you had a problem with that. Okay, I'll close that. And then the last tool we want to deal with is the texture window, which is basically our sharpening tool. So it comes with some defaults depending on the type of film that you're using and the size of the frame. I just like setting these to 0 and dealing with my sharpening in Photoshop, because I think that when you do sharpening in Flexcolor, it tends to sharpen the grain more than anything else, and the noise. Like there is some noise from the scanning process, because it's essentially working like a digital camera does, where it's exposing an image onto a digital sensor. So it's shining light through the negative and making an exposure onto a digital sensor inside the scanner. And if you have areas that are underexposed that you're trying to bring out information in, it'll get noisy. You'll get color noise and a lot of really heavy textures. And sharpening in the scanning software tends just to sharpen those artifacts more, and it can be more problematic to remove that in Photoshop after. So I like to do my sharpening in Photoshop, and I'll kind of show you how to do that in the next step. So like I said, I just leave my unsharp mask to 0 and my flex touch to 0, and then I'll show you best practices for sharpening afterwards in Photoshop. So I'm going to close that. Okay, and then 2 more things we can do. So one, we have our output size here. So right now it's set to the maximum. You see it zooms 100%. It's at a PPI of 300, and we're at 58 by 42 centimeters. We can go up to a 200% zoom. So if I go to 200 and click that, it'll go to 117 centimeters by 85 centimeters big. So considerably bigger, and notice our file size went from 200 megabytes to 800 megabytes. So the image got 4 times bigger. Now, what this is doing is it's not really giving us any more detail or clarity. It's just digitally scaling the image up, just like Photoshop would, because it's scanned at the highest possible resolution when I did the 3F scan, and that was at 100% zoom. So if I go up to 200% zoom, it has to add in pixels, just like you would in Photoshop. If you wanted to add in pixels, if you wanted to make your image bigger, it would have to guess at what pixels it wanted to add. So it would essentially look at all the pixels in your image, and when it needed to add in pixels, it would say, okay, what's the difference between pixel A and pixel B? And then I'll put a pixel that splits that difference in between to make the image bigger, right? So you don't get any more detail and you don't get any more clarity through scaling it up. You just get a bigger file size. So you could choose to output at a 200% size if you wanted a really, really big image. If you're going to print huge, you could also do that in Photoshop, and it would be essentially the same thing. I haven't noticed any negative side effects from scaling up in Flexcolor, so I guess there's no real reason not to do it here, unless you're maybe not sure you want such a huge file size, in which case you could leave it smaller, and then you could always scale up afterwards. So I'm just going to leave it at 100% because I don't think I need this image to be all that big. So once I've done this, once I've done my output size, I've done all my corrections, and I've got my setup right, I could go ahead and save it, and that would save a TIFF file out to my computer. But one thing I wanted to show you real quick, which is very cool, is that you can save presets inside of Flexcolor. So if you guys notice in my thumbnail viewer here, I have these other images that I shot at the same location. Now I've already gone through and edited those in Flexcolor, but let's say I have these 4 images and I'm working on them, and I know I shot them at the same settings, the same lighting conditions, and I wanted to just scan them basically all the same. And this is especially relevant because these next 3 images are panoramic. So I'm going to stitch them together to create the panorama. And I want to make sure I scan them with exactly the same scan settings. So rather than having to remember where I set everything, I can create a preset. And the way I do that is once I've set everything that I want to set, I come up to the File menu, go to Setup, and then down here, you can see I have my setup set as negative RGB standard. I can create a new setup. So I'll click the New button, and I'll title this Amboy. Oh, that's not right. Amboy Water. Amboy was the town that this image was shot in, and I hit Create. And now I have that set up as Amboy Water number 1. And if I hit OK, Now you can see in my setup menu here, I have all my film types, but I also have Amboy Water and Amboy Water 1. I guess I created Amboy Water last night when I did the other scans. So I have a few of my user-defined presets here that I use for other things. So that's a very, very helpful tool in Flexcolor. Okay, anyway, I can go ahead and save this now. So I'll hit save. I'll make sure I'm selecting TIFF as my image format, and I'll send it out to the folder where I want it. So Amboy, let's call this Amboy single because it's a single frame. It's not part of the panoramic. And I'll hit save, and then it's going to go through and save that image. And it's done. And now I have that image on my computer, and I can go ahead and start working on the others. So let me show you a positive negative here. I misspoke. Let me show you a positive image. So this image right here, if I double click it, was shot on color positive film rather than color negative film. So I think the images I was working on before were shot on Kodak Portra, probably 160, and this was shot on Fuji Velvia. So Fuji Velvia is a color positive film. So when you get it processed, the colors are true to life. They're positive. They're not negatives like you have with your black and white film or your color negative film. It's a slide, so you could project light through this and it would show up with the accurate colors. So let me just walk you through editing this one real quick. And I'm going to rotate it. So you have these rotational tools down here, just so I can see it in the right format. And then I want to basically go through all the same steps. So I want RGB standard. So notice I have my standards and then my standard negatives. So your standard setups are for color positive film. So you could say RGB dark saturated, RGB saturated, or RGB standard. And then you have your standard negative, which is just standard negative profile. So we were using negative RGB standard before. Then you have your specific films, which they don't have my particular film here. So I'm just going to go with RGB standard. I'm going to select 4x5 as my frame setup, and then RGB 16-bit as my mode. And then I just want to go through the same exact process I went through before. So I'll draw my marquee inside the image. I will open up my histogram tool. I'll bring my white point and my black points to the end of the histogram, both in my color channels and in my RGB histogram. That looks about right. And then I think that's a little dark, so I'll bring my exposure up a bit to about there. And let's see, how do I feel about the overall cast? I think it's a little bit on the red side, so I'm going to bring some of that red out. And I'm looking down here in particular in this kind of neutral concrete area. So I want to start working that out and getting that looking more sort of gray. And maybe it needs a little bit of green now. And then let's see about blue. Do I want any blues or yellows in there? Somewhere around there looks generally pretty good. It's very low saturation right now. So I know this water and the blue and everything was much, much more vibrant. And I would deal with that again in Photoshop. But I just want to make sure that I don't have any strange color casts that I'm going to have to work on getting rid of after the fact. All right, so that's probably good for my histogram tool. I'm just going to jump in my curves tool because I do think this is a little bit on the low contrast side. So I'm going to just give it a little bit of contrast, basically in the midtones, just because I think it could use it. And I don't want to go too dark because I don't want to lose detail in the shadows here, but somewhere around there looks pretty good. And I don't see any weird kind of cross color casts in the shadows versus highlights. It might be a touch magenta in the shadow still, but this is close enough. I'll deal with that in Photoshop when I get there. And maybe I do want to add in a little bit of saturation. So I'll come into my color tool, and I think in my reds, I definitely want to saturate a little bit more. And you can see as I bring this up, it's kind of dealing with those oranges a little bit. Wow, there it goes. All right, maybe not that much saturation. That's a little bit crazy. Maybe just something like that, maybe it's +5 or so. I think that looks pretty good. And I think that's about where I want it to be. I'm noticing some things now. It looks maybe a little bit blue in the shadows in particular. It's obviously still low contrast and low saturation. These mountains in the back are really, really blue. I would take some of that down in the final print, but that's a masking thing. I don't want to bring that much blue out of the image overall because it will affect this wall here. It'll affect some of the stuff in the building. So I need to deal with that in a selection mask in Photoshop. But otherwise, I think just as a raw scan, that looks pretty good. I am going to bring a little bit of that blue out. That's bugging me. So I'm going to go back into my histogram tool, and I'll just grab my midpoint slider, and I'll take some of that blue out and just bring a little warmth back into it. And I think that looks a lot better. Okay, great. Cool. So from here, I just need to save it out. So again, I need to set my output size. So 80 centimeters by 62 centimeters at 300 pixels per inch. That's the maximum. I could go up bigger if I wanted to, but I'll leave it at that. Oh, sharpening. Let's check that. So see, it wants to bring up my unsharp mask to 250. That's a lot. So I'm going to just, again, bring that down to 0, bring that down to 0, and I'll deal with my sharpening myself in Photoshop later on. And close that. And that looks good. So I'll just hit save. And this one is titled Keeler. So again, the town where it was shot. So I'll say Keeler test, save it out. And it's going. And it's done. Great. Okay, so that's how you want to work with color images in Flexcolor. Again, you don't want to go too crazy with your adjustments. You basically want to make sure you're not clipping your histograms, so you don't blow out your whites or clip your shadows. And then you want to just get your overall colors looking accurate. You don't want any strange casts in the image. You don't want it to be red overall or green overall. You want to get it balanced out. So neutral areas look neutral and everything else is the accurate color relative to your neutrals. So I think that's pretty much all I wanted to show you for Flexcolor. I'm going to start another video here in a minute that takes some of these images into Photoshop and shows you some of the processes I would go to continue working with color editing in Photoshop. All right, stay tuned for that video.